Back there. All right, wonderful. Welcome everybody. We're getting closer and closer to the point where we're going to be talking about our translations of the Bible and some things that are more familiar with us. And so we're glad you're here tonight. And we've got we're in lesson 10 here, and. Here we go, we're going to be talking about the classification of manuscripts and the critical text approach, get into that. We may even get into lesson 11 tonight. So those that do not have lesson 11, raise your hand. Right now we got questions for, it's going to be just about everybody. So we because I didn't get the questions out to you guys on 11 in time for this. So, all right, as Jason's handing the questions for lesson 11 out, we're going to be we're leading up to the lesson 12, which is the looking at how you pick. How you pick the best translations that you want to use for your particular study. And that is something that's extremely important. And so all of these things are kind of leading into that as we get to it. So the classification of manuscripts. Let's talk about this. And the first question this evening is, in way of review, you guys should know this. What movements caused a renewed appreciation for the authority of the Bible? And then what impact did these movements have on classifying biblical manuscripts? So the movements we talked about a few lessons ago, there were two specific movements that went on in the 14s to the 1600s that got all of this moving. Do you remember? You remember what one of them was? Remember, we talked about it for the definition of it is different than Christian humanism. Yes, very different from the humanism of today. Okay, so that was one of the things. What was the other big deal that was going on that Martin Luther was a big part of?
The Reformation movement.
Okay, the Protestant Reformation, exactly. So those are the two big things that they brought about a new look as far as back to the original languages and stuff. And so what were some of the things that, besides the original language, which was one of the things that this brought out, what else was brought out that all of a sudden there was this extreme interest in?
Preserving, classifying biblical manuscripts.
Okay, yeah. The idea of being able to tell older manuscripts from newer manuscripts. What was the major thing that you could tell from a New Testament standpoint when you're looking at a Greek manuscript? What was the thing that you could tell? This one is definitely older than that one. What was
type of writing material that it was made on?
Okay, parchment versus papyrus, right? You could tell the papyrus would be the older versus the parchment. What else? How about the type of writing?
All caps versus the...
Yeah, okay. So you basically have this idea of the uncial or the majuscule manuscripts were all older than when they brought in the minuscule, which added the small letters, okay? So these majuscule texts began to have now a great importance, and people started looking at those because they're thinking, what if the writer, the copier of these texts, was closer in time to the original writer of the text? Well, that just that just means that there's that much less copying that had to occur to get it to this age than 1,000 years from now, when they're doing the minuscule texts, and maybe it's 1,000 years that are removed, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, as opposed to the 1st century, the 2nd century. So again, these ideas started coming out in their minds. So Kyle Pope talked about 3 specific uncial or majuscule manuscripts that were known, they're called in the text criticism world, the 3 witnesses. So what are those 3 witnesses, and why are they important? Now, 2 of them we're going to not talk about very much, or we'll mention it a couple of times, and then we're going to talk about the 3rd one, which is very important. So what was one of the ones that were out there? Okay, Codex Sinaiticus. We're going to talk about that one more in detail, because that one is extra special. So, but there were a couple other ones that Kyle mentioned in there, all of which go back a ways. One has to do with the Vatican. Codex Vaticanus. Okay, so where would you think that one would be residing?
Rome.
Okay, yeah, that one's attached to the Western Roman Empire. That section resides at the Vatican Library, and it was founded in 1475, and it is dated to 300 A.D. So we're talking about a couple of 100 years after the last original writing. Okay, so what was another one? Another famous place, had a big famous library, known in the ancient world as one of the great wonders of the world, the 7 wonders of the world. The Codex what? Alexandrius. Yeah, that's right. And this one was kind of interesting. 1627 was when it was given. It was the Patriarch of Constantinople, interesting individual. It was a gift to King Charles I of England. A lot of stuff happening in the 1600s in England. You remember all of that was going on. And so this is the second one. And then we have the third one, which is what Jesse was talking about, which is the Codex Sinaiticus. And you can tell from the name about where it was found. Yeah, in the Sinai. So we're going to hear some more about that in just a second. Now, one of the things that's interesting about these 3, and they're called the 3 witnesses, it's because they have so much in common. There's so much consistency with these 3, and they're so old. They're all from the same location, Western Europe, or Egypt, and some of the scholars consider these texts to be incontrovertible witnesses because they have so much in common that when you look at that and they're going, these 3 came from completely different places around an early period of time, and they're all saying the same thing. So the textual consistency is a big deal in this. Now, you've seen this chart before, and I throw it in here at this part just to keep us going in this direction. Remember, all of these other things that are listed up here, these great ancient works, Caesar's Gallic Wars. Everybody that's in the military knows about Caesar's Gallic Wars, read that I don't know how many times. But all of these, when you look at the total number of manuscripts that are here, and Kyle's got a chart in the book that talks about this too, but you look at those numbers over there, and then you look at the New Testament numbers. And when you look at the gap of time between when the original was written and the best copy is available, and you look at those gaps in there and everything, you've got to look at the New Testament And you got to say, man, we have got a lot of verification that's available there. And that's going to be important as we talk about classifying the manuscripts and how we're going to use them. But just be aware that, and by the way, it gets better than that. It gets better than this chart as we look at it. So let's talk about the Codex Sinaiticus first. That is the Codex Sinaiticus right there that this guy is reading. The Israelis had it for the longest time, and then they passed it over to the Brits, and so, you know, there's things going around. But that is the actual document right there. So what is the Codex Sinaiticus, and when and where was it discovered? So give me just some general things on this. Where was it found? You can find it in the name. Okay, so we're going to be looking at something with the Sinai. Now this guy that found it, Constantine Tischendorf, lived from 1815 to 1874. This guy was kind of a prodigy in his time. Greek and Latin scholar, something that was not, there weren't many of them around, let's just say, and this guy was really motivated. And he was known for this, deciphering this Codex Ephraemi, which was it was a document written by this guy named Ephraim. And it's sort of like when you have a painting on top of a painting in the paint world. Well, they had writing on top of writing here. And this codex was called Codex Ephraemi after the guy who wrote on top of the stuff that was underneath. The stuff that was underneath was a New Testament, copy of the New Testament. And, you know, paper was expensive back then, and so I got an extra piece of paper, just turn it over and write on it. And it could have been a kitchen list or something. But this was, he scraped it off and found this manuscript from 400 AD underneath all that. So he became pretty famous. And then the big thing was then he continued to go on. He traveled to the Sinai. He went out in the desert. And if you want to read his entire story, it's fascinating. Neil Lightfoot in his book has a good accounting of it, but you could find it anywhere because the guy was pretty famous. But he went into the Sinai desert, went to St. Catherine's Monastery, digging around, and it kind of reminded me of how Josiah found the law when he was they were cleaning out the temple, basically. Well, they were cleaning out places, and in a back room he found the Codex Sinaiticus amongst the other junk that was back there, and the monks were going to burn it for firewood. It was pretty good firewood. I mean, it burned pretty good because it's pretty dry, right? Being there in the desert and stuff. So, but he saved it and managed to take it out. And look what he found. I mean, that is what he found, that whole book right there. So some of the things about it. This is 1844. This is when Tischendorf found it. The document goes back to 300 AD. And you can see it's in the standard 4-column way of doing things. Some of the ones in the 3rd century, they started doing it this way. Prior to that, they didn't do the 4 columns, and so it kind of depended on, you know, those are things that helped them to kind of date this. But this book, this codex, contained all of the New Testament and almost all of the Greek Septuagint Old Testament that was in there. So it's almost a complete Bible. But one of the thing that was so interesting about the Sinaiticus when they found it was that they found, up until this time, The Textus Receptus, and you remember what that was. That was the New Testament, all right, that Desiderius Erasmus from Germany had gone through, and Robert Stephanus worked after him, and they came up with the Textus Receptus, which meant what? Do you remember? The text that was received, the received text, exactly. That was the standard. That was the majority text at the time, up until they found this. And now, all of a sudden, the mind starts working a little bit, because they noticed that there were 12,000 variants between the Sinaiticus and the Textus Receptus. Now, what does that tell you? First of all, okay, the Textus Receptus, where the stuff came from that they used to build the Textus Recepticus, came from the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. The Sinaiticus and these other two witnesses came from the Western Roman Empire, where they were speaking Latin and everything like that. And the folks in the Eastern Roman Empire were speaking Greek for 1,000 years after the folks started speaking Latin in the Western Roman Empire. So that's why most of the things that Erasmus ended up using and Stephanus ended up using, they were in a competition for publication of a Greek New Testament at the time. And they were trying to get as many manuscripts as they could, but they had to rush the thing through to be able to get it. As a matter of fact, that's why Erasmus, he didn't publish an actual full document. He published the notes that go back and point to the document that he was working on. And so basically, that's why there was this difference. And we start to get into the idea of, does it make a difference where the manuscript came from? Does it make a difference how old the manuscript is? And the answer ahead of time is yes, but we're going to get to the whys. All right, so, and then Tischendorf went on to do great things. He published many other works, 8 more editions between 1841 and 1869. So, good stuff. So this is the question that comes up. Now what? What do we do? Everybody was going happily along. The Masoretic text was what we use. If I'm going to be a translator, the Masoretic text is my go-to text for the Old Testament. And if I'm going to translate the New Testament, I use the Textus Receptus. And then I'm done. And I do my translation. Oh, now things are shaking up a little bit, aren't they? 12,000 variants just in the New Testament part. So, and we know the Jews how good a job they were doing on their part. So we got to look at these. Does the age of the text guarantee accuracy? Well, think about it. What if I had a 5-year-old, it's 5 years after an original, and I decide to copy the original? What if I make a mistake in making that copy? Even though that copy's only 5 years old, if it's my copy you're looking at and I got the mistake in my manuscript, I don't care how many people copy it down the road, it's still the same mistake if they're using my manuscript to copy the copy. Whereas somebody may have been 100 years afterwards, and everybody between them got it all right. So even though I'm newer, I'm farther removed, I may have a more accurate one than him. But the problem is, if I'm far removed, how many copies have been made in between? Every time you introduce a handwritten copy, you now introduce another human into the system, which is the possibility for error. So that now we got to go back and remember all those things that people did with the scribes, did to try to keep that from happening. But still, these are questions now that are coming into the minds of these folks we call the text critics. So Does the condition of the manuscript guarantee its accuracy? I found this great. Look at that Codex Sinaiticus. Whole book, whole Bible, still holding up after all those years. Is the reason that it was back in the back of the barn, underneath the hay, wherever it was, is it because it was accurate? Or maybe it got thrown back there because it wasn't accurate. Maybe it got thrown back there because nobody was using it. You got books in your library you don't read anymore? I could see 200 years from now, man, this book's in such great shape. Sell it for $5. This is something that now this is going through people's minds. All right, should the accepted texts, and when I say accepted text, I'm talking about the Masoretic text, the Textus Receptus, should those and the sources of that information, should that be just discarded just because you have newer manuscripts that disagree with them? Or older manuscripts, a few of those that you disagree with. Now you're going to see that there's going to be a big difference in the numbers of manuscripts that come from the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, and there's a good reason for that. But it's one of those things we have to keep in mind as we look through all this. So we're going to talk about this, textual criticism. And we'll hit it right now, and then we're going to hit it again. And these are things that you need to come out of this class with, that you can understand why they do this and what's your translation that you're reading from, how it approaches this. Textual criticism is, by definition, it's just a discipline that attempts to reconstruct the original text or the wording of a document. So it's detectives who are trained in language, the language, either Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, okay, the main three that the original text, the original inspired writers are writing in. Those experts, scholars, their job is to go in and, like detectives, go in and look at all the data available to try to decide from the copies what was the original language, the original words, because the Bible is verbally inspired. What were the original Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic words that were used by the original authors, based on the copies and the evidence of the copies that we have? Okay? So you say that's a daunting task, and it is a daunting task. There's not a lot of these folks that run around doing this. It doesn't pay very much. Kind of nerdy, remembering that we don't have a single copy of an original text. No originals, okay? So we're working with copies. So, and within those copies, there are differences. We're going to talk about that. The more copies that you have, the more manuscripts that you have, and how many did we say we have just of the New Testament? 5,800, and there's probably more now, okay? And that doesn't account translations, which gets it up to 12,000 plus. So if you got 12,000 copies of the Bible, and you're word for word matching every word in those manuscripts, how many variants would you think you might have? You go, man, this is impossible, right? No, well, it's not that bad, and we're gonna look at it. But this is the process, okay? And then we're gonna tell you why you shouldn't be crying right now. All right? There's 4 phases of this. First, all the way on the left side, you got the original copies, all right? We don't have any of those. But it's the original inspired writer putting to paper or parchment the original information on there, okay? And that's from 1500 BC to 100 AD, 1600 years, all those authors, they put it on. And then we have the hand copies. People wrote Some of them were scribes. Some of them were professionals trained to do it. Others were evangelists that I got to go and speak Swahili today. And all I got is the original Greek here, and which I can speak the original Greek, but I got to translate it to Swahili. I got to get somebody that speaks Swahili. And I'll read to him and tell him what it is, and then he's going to write it down in Swahili. That you could see that there could be some professionalism and some non-professionalism depending on what you have. It's all just manuscripts to us, okay? So we need some detectives to be able to help us to figure that out. So those are the hand copies. That's what we're working with. They go from 100 AD all the way to 1600 AD, okay? And then you got, and then we're talking about the Old Testament, New Testament, the time frames and everything. When we look at 100, what we're saying is Bible was done, being written, inspired word was done, completed by that time. So now that's the original, the last of the originals. Now we're looking at what's the first of the copies that we go. And those, if it was all a perfect world, they would be lined up at 0, and the copies start right after the last of these, and away you go. But the hand copies are what the textual critics work with. And then the third one is the critical text. What they're doing is they're taking manuscripts, and it could be fragments, could be full books, all kinds of different pieces, bits and pieces of all the different books of the Bible, and they're compiling all those to get a full text of the Word. And we talked about how we got to the canon. People, back in the first century, when they're reading that, they go, these are the books that are included. These are the ones that are inspired. Okay, so these are the ones that need to be copied. Okay, and then they start copying those. So that's how they started with number 2, the hand copies. So all those fragments that are found, they get pulled together and they get pulled into a single place, and it's called the critical text. A critical text is pulling all these pieces together in there. Most of the time it's used with the New Testament, when we talk about critical text, because the folks in the Hebrews had their act together, and so it's fairly simple with them. But the New Testament was more Wild West kind of way of getting through it. And then the final thing is the translations that comes out. So here's the way it works. You got the textual critics. They have the number 2 stuff. They've got all those hand copies. The bits and pieces, they pull it all together, and they create then, okay, they produce the number 3. They produce the critical text. That text then becomes the foundation for the translator to come in and use that text to then translate from that original language to the new language for the translation. So they can then produce the number 4, the translation, for us to read. And that's how we get from the beginning to the end on this, okay? That's the system. Now, the part that you and I have to worry about is picking the right number for our use, okay? And we can do that by looking at what they did in creating the number 2 and the number 3. And they tell us what they did in a lot of places, in the front of your Bible and in other places. So you don't have to guess at it. So that's a great thing. So what are 2 different approaches towards textual criticism? There's 2 different ways that if we're going to do the New Testament and we're going to create a document to work from for a translation, okay, what is one of the ways that we can do that? And the 2 ways are polar opposites of each other. Okay, so one is
critical text approach.
Okay, and we've been talking about critical text, right? Okay, so critical text approach is the first one. The exact opposite of that, of the critical text, would be what?
Majority text.
The majority text approach. Okay, and as you look at what the titles of these things are, you can kind of get a feel for which direction we're going in that. So let's look at the critical text approach first. Okay, this one started back in 1881. So this technique is fairly recent. Now, you remember when the Codex Sinaiticus was found? The other two were already available. Okay, Alexandrinus and the other one, Vaticanus. Yeah, those were already available. But you remember what year the Sinaiticus was found by Tischendorf? What's that? 1844, right. So this is 1881. It's about 40 years later. And two men, Westcott and Hort, they looked at all of this that was available to them, and they thought about it, and they said, the closer that we get to the original, as far as time, well, that should be more accurate, shouldn't it? Because there's not as many copies that would be made during that period of time. You know, in 1,000 years, if you start copying this document, 1,000 years of copying, that's a lot of copies that are out there. So chances of error maybe are a little more than something that was copied 50 years later, or even at the same time that the author was alive. So basically, they're in there looking at it and saying, it's quality versus quantity. The older the copy is, in their mind, the more accurate it is. So the closer to the original, the more accurate, because not as many copies are being made of it. And so they went in and they looked for only the uncial and the majuscule texts. And they went to the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus as their primary sources. And they looked at the Textus Receptus and said, too many mistakes, too many errors in there. Now, why would they think that there were too many errors in the Textus Recepticus?
You get all those variations.
There were a lot of variations in it, but which was the newer of the? Yeah, this was the older, closer to the original, where the Textus Receptus, most of that was written between the copies that they have available between the 13th and 14th century. So we're talking about 1,000 plus years before to get to the best of the manuscripts that they had for that. And again, they knew the story behind Desiderius Erasmus about them having to hurry up and get to because remember the Gutenberg press had just come out, and the first full book that was printed was what? On the Gutenberg press? The Gutenberg Bible, that's right. And guess who got that? Who beat them to the punch to get that Bible on there? That was Desiderius Erasmus, the guys with the Textus Receptus, okay, New Testament. And so that became, because it was published and published and published and published and published over and over again, that became the standard. And so these guys here, Westcott and Hort, are going, that's not a good reason for, they're not, that's not very accurate. I'm going to go with the older ones and use that as my primary source. So this became, the critical text approach became the standard Greek text for modern interpretation and translation. The modern translations that you have in front of you today rely on, to a great extent, primarily on the creation of a critical text. The newest ones are taken over by these guys, Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society. They're the ones that are doing the updates on the critical text for all the translations. And you can see all these translations over here, they all use the critical text approach as their primary way of doing things, but it's not the only way. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's been like 19 or 20 years since I had the class on textual criticism, but if you want a quick example, one that pops to my mind is John chapter 5.
We're getting to that one.
Are you?
Yep, hang on. Okay. What is the majority text? We're going to get to that one in a couple slides. Yeah. What is the majority text approach? Okay, so let's look at this one. This one is newer as far as going through. 1982, Hodges and Farstad. And they call it also the Byzantine or the ecclesiastical text. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into in a second. But this one looks at the majority. This one looks at the pure number of manuscripts. How many times is Mark 16:16 in a manuscript? I've got 5,000 available to me or whatever. Every place that it shows up, whatever the reading is of it gets one vote. Okay, and this is why they call it the majority. They call it the democratic method of going through things. And so if it's the wording is, and these Greek words are used in this time, that's 3 votes, 4 votes, 5 votes. Oh, no, it's now a different word is in there. That's 1 vote for that. And they add up all the votes, and they look at it and say, well, the most votes are for this particular word, therefore that must be the word that is used in there. And that's how they get the majority text to work. Now, there's a couple problems here highlighted in green. The first is that it doesn't account at all for the age of the manuscript and where it was found. So, problem comes in is that most manuscripts, of the 5,800 plus manuscripts we saw on the chart, most of those are found from the 12th through the 14th century, and they come out of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek Orthodox Church. And why is that? Because they spoke Greek for 1,000 years after the guys in the West were taken over by the Goths and it switched over to Latin as their primary language and all that kind of stuff. So they kind of lost. That's why there's so many Greek. Remember, we're talking about the Greek language, right? For the New Testament, Koine Greek. These guys spoke Greek for an extra 1,000 years. So of course they're going to have their translations are going to be for themselves, and they're in Greek and Greek, and all the way down the line. So that kind of skews the majority text towards the Eastern texts. And these all are the ones that are far removed from the originals. Over on the other side of that, the Textus Receptus, and here's the dirty little secret on this one. When Robert Etienne and those guys, and when they used the manuscripts they were looking for, they were Byzantine manuscripts. So the Textus Receptus reads an awful lot like the majority text when they put it together. And that's because most of the texts, again, it's skewed to the Eastern Orthodox. So the bottom line is, if you're going to do a translation in and of itself, don't just rely on one thing. And this is where they say, especially the majority text, don't rely on that alone. So now here's the rule of thumb for translations as we come to the end of the period here. The best translation method takes all of these things into account. So we're talking about numbers of manuscripts. Fine, let's get as many manuscripts as possible to do this translation. The age, how old is the manuscript? How close is it to the original? And all of these things, the location, where it's found, the difficulty of the text. One of the ways that they find out whether or not something is, they try to get inside the mind of the scribes as far as what's going on. And the scribes tended to stay if they were going to change something themselves, they tended to make it easier. Good scribe, he's trying to make the reading understandable, so he tries to make it easier. The really good scribe, though, is the one that just copies what's there already. And so those Pauline texts that are difficult to understand, the good scribe would just, they're still difficult to understand. I'm writing down what the original words are. Whereas the not-so-good scribe is trying to help people by explaining it a little bit. So the simpler the explanation, the worse the scribe. And so these guys actually know this stuff for this. So this is the other big point. It's appropriate to test the accuracy of the manuscripts. The manuscripts are not some sacred thing that they were done by humans, they were copied by humans, and so as humans, and children of God, it's our responsibility to test what's there. And so that's why we have these scriptures, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things. For sure, that's what we need to do. So now as we get into this next, and this is going to float into Lesson 11 and Lesson 12, so are going to kind of float together here a little bit. And the reason is because we're going to be talking about modern translations. And so we're going to start this off today, and we'll probably get almost to where Jesse was with his question. So modern translations, now we're finally talking about them. What is textual criticism, and what is the role of text critics? Okay, this is a review. We just went over. Instead of having a week between, now you just have a couple of minutes. Do you remember what the role is of the text critic, and what is textual criticism? What is the goal of textual criticism?
Reconstruct the original text.
Reconstruct the original text. Yes, that's it. Because the original text is God's word. All this other stuff is not God's word. The original text is. So we're trying to get to the original text. And that's what their job is. It's the art and science of reconstructing the original text as close as we possibly can get based on the information that we have that's there. And so we have to rely on God and His providence that He has kept this protected for us, which He has, and with all the things that we've seen before. What the text critics do is they examine the available evidence, and then they have to make a lot of important decisions as to the final outcome of what the wording is that they're going to use for that, based on all the information, the age of the text, etc. And then the original texts are then translated. Okay, so that's how it finally works out. All right, so here we are. When we come back on next week, finish up your reading, and especially in the index section of the book. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in there. We're going to talk about the translations as part of Lesson 11 here and all of this. So we'll see you guys next week.